Hey everyone, welcome back to a commentary on the regional I attended last weekend. I played both the runner and corp side. Today I'll be featuring the corp side where I played Code Gate Accidents. So imagine a runner taking a nice little stroll in the park with their pet files when all of a sudden a wild XU appears and it jumps the skull into half, sending the runner into hell. The runner's constricted, XU suffocates the runner, and what can the runner do? They can only struggle in the submission and concede as the Code Gate Accident stacks takes yet another victim. That's right. You might have seen this accident stack before. This was first published as a barrier version with 14 barriers and no other ice. Then it evolved into its next form, a Code Gate accident, with code gates instead of barriers. And now I built upon this, basically using this as a base, swapped a couple of cards around, and here we go. This is the list. For those of you who still haven't seen this deck out in the wild before, well, you have been living under a rock because this deck is nasty. It has two different ways of interacting with your opponent's breakers. And the objective is obviously to remove all your opponent's decoders and AI breakers from the game and make sure that they can't win, because if they can't get through your end-to-end code gates, they can't win, they'll be forced to concede. So yes, the two different ways are on the screen as you see. The Hunter Seeker, which came out in Terminal Directive along with Skorpios, as well as the Hatchet Drop Salem's combo. For those of you who haven't heard of this, it basically works as such. As long as you are richer than the runner, in fact you can actually be on the same credit level or one fewer credit than them, if depending on their link strength. If you fire off a hatchet drop, you can send the installed breaker into the hand. Before they get a chance to install it, you play Salem's, naming that breaker, forcing them to discard it from the hand because it's a trash. You then remove it with Skorpios, they can never get it back. So the combination of these two breaker removal cards is very powerful because they each target different niches and have different trigger conditions, especially hatchet drop, which doesn't require a run to be made at all. So yeah, as long as you're richer, it is effective. Of course, even though this is the final evolved form, or so I claim, it didn't do as well as the other two decks. I didn't finish in the top two. People actually knew how to play against this deck because people have seen it out in the wild, so it's not that effective, which is a bit unfortunate. So some of you might be wondering, why did I choose the Code Gate version over the barrier version? Well, here on the I was basically teching against Anarchs for this tournament. You can't really bring a deck that covers most of your bases nowadays, so I was aggressively teching for the Anarch matchup. Looking at the screen, these are the typical answers that Anarchs have to code gates. David does not count because I don't run any code gates of strength 5 or above. So among these four code gates, York is blank against Lotus Field because without something like Net Ready Eyes or some way to boost the strength of York, they are not getting through Lotus Field. Meanwhile, the AI breakers are vulnerable to triple advanced Hortum, and this is a big advantage that the Code Gate deck has over the barrier deck, because the barrier deck runs wraparound, but wraparound doesn't hard wall AI breakers. AI breakers find it hard to break wraparound, but it's not impossible. It's only 7 strength. They have to pay more, but they can still get through. Hortum, on the other hand, is a hard wall. If they do not have a non-AI Code Gate breaker, well, they're not getting past Hortum, simply put. And the bonus is if they do face check your Hortum without a triple advanced Hortum without any decoders installed, you trigger the second subroutine, which allows you to search for 2 cards from your deck. And if you search for the other 2 Hortums in your deck, you can then build a wall to completely seal out the runner from R&D, HQ, and your scoring remote. So basically what this means is that the 3 of the 4 common Code Gate breakers from the Anarch faction are effectively useless against this deck, leaving with most Anarchs only the single Black Orchestra. This is what most typical Anarchs do. They put the 1 Black Orchestra in the deck in case they face against these York or Hortum matchups. But Skorpios Code Gate does very well against this because these Anarch decks typically don't pack Hunter Seeker defense, nor do they pack Employee Strike. Most Anarch decks choose to spend their influence on Temujin or Rumor Mill instead to deal with Estelle Moon decks, and so this leaves them vulnerable to Code Gate accidents. All I need to do is to snipe the 1 Black Orchestra in their deck whether it's through Salem's, Hatchet Job, or Hunter Seeker, or some combo of them, and I auto-win. They are forced to concede. It's as simple as that. So, yes, this is basically how you make a meta call and how you shape your deck such so as to deal with the meta that you're trying to prepare for. I specifically included 3 Lotus Fields and 3 Hortons in my deck to deal with any Anarch matchup, and it worked. I basically won every single game against Anarch decks. My losses were mainly to Shapers. Yes, alright. So yeah, to the depths of Skorpios land you go, Black Orchestra. We won't be seeing any Anarchs around anytime soon. So that's basically my deck introduction. We'll now head into a gameplay video where I play against a Kate deck. This one's gonna be quite a challenging matchup for me because it's not Anarch. We'll see how I deal with it. So this game is against Tim Fowler, and this is actually a top cut game, so we both know each other's decks. In particular, I know that his Breaker Suite is the Deus Ex with Adjusted Matrix, but that is pretty difficult to deal with because he probably runs multiple copies of them. What I'm more concerned with is striking off his non-AI breaker, which is Savant. So Deus Ex is actually an AI breaker because you add the Adjusted Matrix onto it. So I'm not really concerned with that. Once I get my triple Hortum out, I'll be fine with it. The bigger problem is Savant. Savant completely wrecks my deck because it breaks every single code gate for cheap, and we can't have that. So my one and only goal this game is to kill the Savant. Now we are a few turns in. My opponent is drawing for stuff, installs a bunch of stuff. Meanwhile, I quickly pump out an Oak Town before my opponent gets their Breaker Suite set up. This Skorpios deck is typically a rush deck. You do want to abuse the early scoring window to get agendas out and punish your opponent if they actually try to contest your early agendas, because with naked breakers on the table, it'll be easy to use Hunter Seeker to kill them. Now, before I advance my Oak Town, I decide to Salem's my opponent, calling out Savant. As I mentioned, I need to kill the Savant, so I use Salem for Savant, and my opponent showed me that they didn't have it, but they showed a bunch of other stuff, including Rumor Mill, Dag Deer, E3 feedback plants, nothing too exciting. So I decided to score the Oak Town here, get it out of the way. I could have left it in the remote for a bit longer given that my opponent didn't show any breakers, but at this point I just wanted to rush out, because I kind of knew that with the Film Critic on the table, which I see, Hunter Seeker is off the tables. And if my opponent gets too rich for me and turns off my Hatchet Job win condition, I will be in a lot of trouble. So here I just continue drawing up for agendas, and Oak Town would be really nice right now. If I did find an Oak Town here, you'll be sure I'll jam it straight into the remote. But all I see is ice, just a whole bunch of ice. So I don't really need ice at this point. In fact, after the first 3 or 4 copies of ice, the rest are redundant. You don't really need ice, more than 1 piece of ice on each server, because this is very much a binary deck. Either your opponent can get through your servers or they cannot. If they cannot, so be it, you know. And if they can, a second piece of ice does not change things. So I draw into an IPO here, not very interesting. I draw into a Jackson here. That's the next best thing I can draw, I guess, aside from my Oak Town. So I jam the Jackson into the remote and play IPO. Except I can't play IPO? Yeah, I do. Okay. So now I'm still relatively rich compared to my opponent. However, they're about to get a Hyperdriver Fire. Now my opponent runs Hyperdriver to speed up their initial setup phase. This is not a combo diaper deck or any, you know, any combo deck that aims to win in 1 turn with a mega turn. The Hyperdrivers are there solely to speed up my opponent's tempo, and it works very well because this deck already runs Dag Deer, which allows you to install Hyperdriver without worrying about memory costs or the install cost. So my opponent sets up economy, and this is where I know that my scoring window is closing very rapidly on me. With data folding shown on the table, I am very concerned that my opponent will data fold their way into victory, because that is such a strong passive economy card. I Jackson draw into more ice here. I'm currently completely flooded with ice. I much rather be agenda flooded right now. This is the time to pump out agendas. I know my opponent has an SMC, but I do have best defense in the deck to deal with that as well. Unfortunately, the agendas just didn't come, and I was forced to pitch a lot of my ice. So this is a lot of tempo conceded to my opponent, who now is able to continue setting up. So yes, this deck really requires you to be very... Oh, I actually used the Jackson here. Yeah, I guess I used the Jackson here because I wanted to reshuffle the Salem's back into my deck. And I did not want my opponent to drop a Rumor Mill on me, because that would prevent me from using Jackson to shuffle Salem's back in. I do want the Salem's because I need to call out Savant. Every time I draw into the Salem's, I want to call out Savant to snipe it from my opponent's hand. Because I know at this point, once the Savant hits the table, I am very unlikely to win. Because Hunter Seeker is probably off the tables now that Film Critic is installed. And Hatchet Job is getting really difficult because my opponent's starting to become really rich. They have at least 15 credits, I believe, off to the side of the screen right there. And my opponent pitches a Rumor Mill here. I draw into yet another piece of ice. What can I do with this? Not much. I don't really have an agenda in hand. I'm holding the best defense in my hand, but the best defense isn't going to do anything because my opponent already used the self-modifying code. So at this point, the only thing I can really do is draw. The other option I have is to click for 3 credits so that I'll become richer than my opponent. But I know that clicking for credits is pretty bad because I'll lose out in the long haul. So what I do here is really questionable. I install ice on R&D. This might be a mistake. I think I was very worried about deep data mining because I did see that off the Salem's, I believe. Or I know that the deck runs deep data mining at least. And with Deus Ex setup, this might mean that my opponent's angling for an R&D run sooner or later and going for deep data mining. My opponent installs a Beth here. Lady Beth is going to cause me a lot more trouble. If I give my opponent a free click, that's at the very least a free credit every turn, and I can't have that. Combined with the data folding, this means that I will almost certainly not money out outmoney my opponent. So at this point, I concede the money war and instead go for the only possible win condition remaining for me, which is preemptively using Salem's on my opponent's Savant. That is the win condition I'm looking for. So to do this, I preemptively triple advance my Hortum, which is the outer ice on R&D. This is why I installed a second piece of ice on R&D. It makes sense now because the inner ice was a Mausolus. That is not going to stop AI breakers. So you notice that I'm specifically keeping myself on 14 credits here. I do not want to give my opponent an extra click. Extra draw is fine. Draw is not going to help them. If anything, it's going to help them find the Savant faster, which allows me to Salem's it. So I try for the Salem's here, calling out Savant. My opponent doesn't show it. They only show a bunch of adjusted matrices, 2 DDMs, and another Film Critic instead. So this is starting to look really grim for me. I know that my opponent can contest my scoring remote anytime they wish because they have adjusted matrix ready to go. So yeah, at this point all I can do is to just click for credits and be sure to keep myself at the magic 14 credit level so that my opponent doesn't get an extra click. Yep. So at this point I'm just waiting for my opponent to set up and hopefully I can do something, maybe bait them into running 2 agendas at the same time so that I can trigger Hunter Seeker, which I still haven't drawn yet, I think. So yeah, a lot of problems right now. I've drawn to my second Jackson, and this is where I think I can make a run for it by drawing extra cards into my hand. So yeah, very tricky situation here because there's no scoring window for me at all. I cannot score an agenda. My opponent is just going to run my remote trivially. Another possibility was triple advancing the Hortum on my remote. Given that my opponent hasn't shown Savant yet, this might have been a good idea. If I the remote ice is indeed a Hortum. If I triple advance it, I can start jamming agendas in it. So that actually sounds like a really good idea, and I possibly should have set up for this a lot earlier. Instead of triple advancing the Hortum on R&D, I should have put the 3 advancements on the remote instead. I think there's a global foot in my hand, and this is something that I should be jamming right about now. That might have changed the course of this game. Instead, now I'm agonizing over my win conditions. This Skorpios deck wins as easily as it loses, and when it loses very hard. My window has all but closed. Oh yes, okay, so now I can see my hand. There's no global food actually. All I have is a hostile takeover. And this hostile is not going to do me any favors. If I score it right now, I gain a 5 credit burst, but in the long run, this is going to benefit my opponent more. I knew that if I scored the hostile here, I would leave my opponent with a lot more money than me because they're getting the free click from Beth every turn, and they're getting the discount from the bad publicity, meaning that they can run more aggressively. So this is a really agonizing place to be in, and the correct answer is probably just to draw more cards or to advance the remote So either way, it just wasn't really good for me. So yeah, to talk a bit about this Kate deck, it's a really interesting Kate deck. One very interesting interaction that both myself and my opponent were aware of is that Deus Ex with Adjusted Matrix is actually an AI breaker. So you cannot actually use the click ability that is now on Deus Ex to break a 3 advanced Hortum. If my opponent actually ran into the 3 advanced Hortum thinking they could break it for a deep data mining run, they would be very, very shocked, and I would gain a huge advantage. But that's not the case, obviously. Tim's a really good player, and he knew his outs. One thing you realize that he did very well was that he was very focused on getting his money up. A lot of his turns were spent actually clicking for credits, and that is one of the best ways you can beat this Skorpios deck. Simply by outmoneying the Skorpios deck, you take away the main threat of Hatchet Job Salem's, which is a very one of the key parts to making this Skorpios deck work. And this is the big reason why this deck is just not that good once your opponent knows what you're up to. So yeah, against the opponents I played, those opponents who managed to beat me are those who knew my game plan and they knew they had to money up. You typically want to take things slower against this Skorpios deck because if they score 1 or even 2 agendas, it doesn't matter too much. They can't really do anything other than to threaten 7 agenda points. So you can spend your time setting up your money and setting up your breakers and then going in to close out the game and making sure they can't score out the last few points. So that is how you play against this Skorpios deck. Even if you don't have tech, there's always a way out. Here I draw my global food about time, 4 or 5 turns too late, but well, something has to happen here. I think watching back on this video stream, I realize how obvious I am with my plays. The moment I start looking at all my eyes, you could tell that I basically just drew an agenda, and I'm wondering whether it is time to score it. Oh, it seems so obvious at first sight. So yeah, I think this is another thing that this is another point of distinction between the mediocre players and better players like those that you normally see in top cuts. I am very transparent when it comes to my plays, and this is really bad for court plays. So my opponent does indeed challenge my global food and obviously hosts it on the Film Critic. After running through the Quandary and Hortum, which cost them 2 clicks to break, but no worry about that. I could actually jam double advance here, the second global food, and that was something I would have done. Unfortunately, my opponent spent their final click to drop a second Film Critic. So there was no point in dropping a second agenda there because obviously my opponent would just go get it. So with double Film Critic, my Hunter Seeker plan is definitely completely off the table because usually one way you can bait your opponent into Hunter Seeker submission is to lure them into running somewhere and stealing 2 agendas at the same time. They can only host one on Film Critic, they can't host the other. This means that Hunter Seeker will get them and you might find a way back into the game. This is not going to happen here, however. So my opponent runs HQ knowing that the agendas must have piled up in here. The agendas haven't really. I must say, the agendas were... I wasn't agenda flooded at all. It just so happened that I didn't draw the agendas earlier when I needed them, and now I am. Also, there was no reason to score the hostile, so I didn't score it. My opponent did get the hostile, however, so now they are at 5 points, I think. They stole a food earlier from my remote, and through the HQ runs, they stole 2 agendas. So this puts them at 5 agenda points. So I was just sitting there and closing my eyes and thinking, what outs did I have? And my mind drew a blank, and rightfully so. There were no outs. So yeah, this was actually a really long time because I was just sitting there going like, this tournament has been so unfortunate. But well, the game continues, and I'll just keep drawing, I guess, and play the Glacier game. One interesting out that I may or may not have is using lots and lots of ice to defend against the click nature of Deus Ex. But as you see from my opponent's rig, they finally found a Savant, and this means that they can just break through my remote without using clicks. So one way you can actually keep the Adjuster Matrix deck out is by having more than 4 pieces of ice on your remote. This means that even on the first click run, they won't have enough clicks to get through the entire server. But this is completely relevant when my opponent's super rich, with 2 data foldings, 1 Beth, and the Savant, most importantly. So my opponent finally goes for an R&D access here to clear the Christian grid of R&D, but ends up winning anyway, as the top card is an agenda that my opponent scores to win. So that was a very unfortunate game where the deck that was supposed to headlock the opponent ended up getting locked out instead. But I only have myself to blame. I brought this deck myself. I knew that games were going to be lopsided one way or another, and the matchup just didn't favor me. That's all it was. Or, I mean, I should say it's not so much a matchup, it's just that this deck is very much reliant on variance. Earlier on in the Swiss rounds, I had a game where I played against an Anarch and won very handily because my opponent's only Black Orchestra was the 45th card of the deck. Conversely, in this game, I needed my opponent to draw the Savant in the top half of the deck. That way, I could Salem's it from the hand, but they didn't, so I lost. Putting my win rate more in the variance basket instead of the skill basket was my own undoing, and I deserved it. That being said, speaking of the skill basket, there was actually one line of play, very, very subtle and very hidden, that you probably wouldn't be able to guess. But I implore you to think about it anyway. Can you identify the one thing I could possibly have done to give myself a much better chance of winning? Pause the video if you need to think, because this is a very obscure line of play that most people probably wouldn't think of. The answer is to actually not score the first Oak Town. What I should have done was to treat it as a magnum opus or something like a Capital Investors. Leave it on the table and keep hammering at it for 6 credits a turn. No way my opponent would be able to keep up with this because they do not run magnum opus. Their economy was clicking for credits and passive economy that they cannot gain with clicks. So because of this, I would be able to easily outmoney my opponent. By the time they found their Beth, I would have easily 30 or something credits, and before they get the Deus Ex Adjuster Matrix combo going, I would have found the time to triple advance the Hortum the remote. That would force them to get the dedicated processor if they wanted to, not dedicated, the Adjuster Matrix and the Savant on the table if they wanted to actually contest my money. If they did, then I would be able to use the Hatchet Salem's combo to just completely ruin them. So this was what I should have done, and this was a line I completely didn't see that one of the commentators ended up bringing up to me after the game, simply because I didn't have practice with this deck. Simply put, I just didn't know all the outs and the possible lines of play with this deck. So yeah, this goes to show how much skill there is still involved in piloting this deck, despite it being mostly down to how good the matchup is and draw variance. Yeah, the more you know. Very interesting line of play that I could have done right there. What can I say? I deserve to lose. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hope you learned something. I sure have. In the meantime, happy net running. I'll see you next time.